Let me welcome you and to Carnegie Europe and for a conversation about one of the many, many days that we commemorate, this year and in these years really. It's so full of centenaries and other centenaries and other commemorative occasions that it's very hard to actually follow suit and to be alert to all of them. But we thought when Brendan Sims came to my office in March of last year and we talked about Waterloo, we immediately thought that we needed to do this. Because Waterloo, the battle itself is interesting enough, but it also points to some of the political realities of today, some of the military realities of today. And so we said, okay, let's do this. Let's do once the book is out. And the book is indeed out. You've seen it. It's on sale here tonight. And we can have a discussion about this. And invite one of the best commentators on these kinds of affairs, actually on stage, which of course is Jamie Shea, who has been with Carnegie Europe quite often, who's a great friend of ours, and who's one, of course, of these landmark people, if there's such a thing, here in Brussels, who appears often on stage and always has something brilliant to say. And it's also great because we have a Cambridge versus Oxford kind of race here today. Jamie's got his PhD from Oxford, and of course Brendan is teaching history in Cambridge. And so we have basically all elements for a great fun night here. Also, I see General Bradshaw here, who's joined us tonight, which is our great honor. Thank you very much. The Deputy Secure here tonight with us. Fantastic honor for us. Thanks for coming over. I know that you're tight on time, but we really appreciate that you could make it over. What can I say? This is a momentous time in Europe, and we have discussions about the European order, left and right, about the political and the military order of Europe. We've seen momentous events last year, and the modern European order really came all about, with Napoleon. And Napoleon ended 200 years ago at Waterloo. And so basically, what the lessons from that time and the decisions that he made and the opposition against him that finally prevailed shaped Europe in many ways that are still relevant today. And we want to actually inquire about that. Apart from the book that we want to praise and the actual events on the ground on that day, we also want to talk about what that means for today. And we will talk about coalitions, because it was an interesting coalition, of course, that was pitted against Napoleon. And we want to talk about, perhaps a little bit at least, about the crucial role of Germany, which is a bit of a special issue for Brendan, whose big book, The Struggle for Supremacy, was already about this. And the current book on Waterloo, to a certain extent, is also about that in a different way. And perhaps we also want to, just for the fun of it, look at a few historical counterfactuals, which is in this specific Napoleonic case very, very fascinating. Brendan Sims is a professor for history at Cambridge University. He's also establishing a Center for Geopolitics and Grand Strategy at that university. And he is also the founder of the Project for a Democratic Union, which is really a think tank that thinks about the future of Europe. And so we have a polymath here who can tell us all about the stuff that we need to do and finally actually heed, and then we will have a better future. That's great. And then we have Jamie here, who's of course working for the coalition of today, the alliance that keeps us all safe and secure, and who's one of the primary also kind of spokespeople still for NATO. And think tankers love you, Jamie, because you will actually say something. And
guaranteed.
And it's fantastic, and that's why we have you back. We will also, as I said, sell the book. It was already on sale, and we will sell it afterwards as well. And it will be signed by Brendan Sims if that's what you want. So please approach Brendan afterwards, and he'll write into your copy of the book. And then we will have a reception afterwards, a quick one. It's our strategy of cheap and yummy, which is what we have to do at Carnegie. And you can eat at Carnegie all of the things that you would usually not eat, which is chips and cheese and all of that stuff, without any of the nutritious, positive elements that you should actually eat. You can eat them here guilt-free and wash them down with a little bit of wine afterwards. And hopefully we will continue the discussion then. Now I've talked way too long. I want to hand it over to Brendan, who will give us a 10-minute rundown into the topics that I've talked about. Jamie will comment. We will have a bit of a discussion here, and then, of course, we will open it to your questions. And then I hope we have a great evening here tonight. Thanks again for coming. Brendan, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that kind introduction, and indeed for the invitation
and I extend my thanks more generally to Carnegie Europe for their hospitality. I've been invited to reflect on the battle 200 years on, which, as the invitation said, marked the end of Napoleonic tyranny in Europe and ushered in almost half a century of European peace. But we're also here, I think, it's been alluded to discuss the importance of Waterloo for today's strategy debate. And we might get a bit of a glimpse of what Europe's future could be like in the light of one of the more important dates of commemoration in 2015. Of course, we look at the anniversary of Waterloo in the light of other events and other factors. So, for instance, last year we commemorated the start of the First World War, which rather crowded out the 200th anniversary of the personal union between Great Britain and Hanover, the North German Principality of Hanover, ruled by George I, who then George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, who then became King of Great Britain. And this was a dynastic link which lasted from 1714 to the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. And the King's German Legion, the events I'll be talking about today, that particular snapshot in the Battle of Waterloo, would not have existed if it had not been for this personal union. But I fear that commemoration was somewhat overshadowed, understandably, by that of the First World War. We're also speaking against the background of the current European crisis, of course, the currency and political crisis, but more particularly, and I think Jamie Shea will speak more about this, the strategic crisis of Europe, mainly in the East, the Baltic and the Ukraine. But this crisis is, I think, at its root, a crisis about Europe itself, and particularly the German question, which is how to engage and mobilize the country at the heart of Europe, which has, as a result of the Second World War, a strong pacifist tradition, an unease with the use of military force, and which has been, by and large, a retardative factor in dealing with crises such as Russia and Libya. And a little bit of what I want to do in the book and this evening is to point to the existence of an alternative German tradition, which perhaps could be drawn upon by not only Germany today, but Eurozoners in general. Now, Waterloo was a decisive battle. It was regarded as such by contemporaries. It's listed as such in most of the books. It decides the question of French domination in Europe. It settles the so-called Western question, which is that French domination should end. And it led to, of course, the system in Europe of the Congress of Vienna, which was a conservative, if you will, but a largely liberal in terms of international governance. In other words, there would be no domination by one single power. So Waterloo is decisive. But what was the decisive moment in the Battle of Waterloo? Many of these have been claimed. The defense of Hougoumont, the arrival of the Prussians, Napoleon started too late, and so on. All of these are reasonable points. But the reason why I'm here is because I've written on what I regard as the crucial factor, which is the defense of the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte that afternoon in June 1815. And by the way, we have one of the owners of La Haye Sainte, Suzanne Cornet-Delsios, here in the audience this evening. I thank you again for your help in writing the book. And Napoleon's strategy, very briefly, was to punch his way through the Allied centre. He had to grapple with Wellington, defeat him, before Blücher could unite with his ally. He couldn't go around the Allied position. There wasn't time. So he had to plough through the middle. And right at the heart of that position, as I say, was this farmhouse. And it was defended at the start of the battle by 378 riflemen of the 2nd Light Battalion of the King's German Legion, commanded by a Major Bering. Now, he was later joined by reinforcements, but he's the principal figure, and those men are the principal protagonists in the story. They are attacked close to the start of the battle by the main French thrust of the Corps of d'Erlon, the left wing of which attacks La Haye Sainte. And the French failed to take the farmhouse at the first attempt. And in the course of the afternoon, repeated attacks are repulsed. And the book, I won't go into detail here, but the book describes the drama of those hours. So, for instance, figures like Rifleman Lindau of the 2nd Light Battalion, who, although heavily injured, continues to fight on, refuses Bering's injunctions to go to the rear to have his wounds dressed, in fact pours rum into the wound. Seems to be medically somewhat problematic. But in any case, did the trick. The story of the burning barn, where the newly arrived Nassauers used their field kettles to ferry water from the pond to put out the fire. The confused hand-to-hand combat in the courtyard and in the house when the French finally scale the walls and break in. The frantic withdrawal supervised by Bering but covered by a intrepid rearguard. There's the story of the troops of the King's German Legion outside the farm, particularly the remarkable vignette of the commander, the brigade commander, Colonel von Omteder, who is told to retake this farm because it's so tactically important, and although he regards the instruction as suicidal, leads his men and is in fact killed. And many of his troops likewise lose their lives, a pointless death in many ways. But the point is that even though eventually the defenders run out of ammunition and withdraw, and only 42 men are left with Bering's unit at the end, so 42 out of 378. The balance are not dead, let me hasten to add, but they're dispersed elsewhere on the battlefield. The point is that these men have held up Napoleon for almost 5 hours, which gave time for the Prussians to arrive in strength and thus decide the battle in favor of Napoleon, in favor of Wellington, and against Napoleon. So that's the drama of the story, and that's why it's significant, I think, for European history. But the other reason I'm here is to talk about the remarkable nature of this body of troops, the King's German Legion. It's established in 1803 to mobilize the Hanoverian subjects of George III against Napoleon. So Hanover, which is the homeland of these people, has been overrun by Napoleon, and the British Army sets up a unit. This is not an auxiliary unit, it is a unit of the British Army, but it is made up very largely of foreigners. It draws in not merely Hanoverians, but Germans from all parts of the former Holy Roman Empire. And what results is a curious military and cultural hybrid. It's an Anglo-German hybrid. So it's bilingual, both militarily and culturally. And the people, both officers and to a certain extent men, regard themselves also as in some sense, English culturally. They take on English names, for instance. They adopt English customs, English sports, cricket, that sort of thing. And these last on, by the way, in the Hanoverian army after 1815. But there's also a very strong ideological motivation with these men, a little bit like the Free French of the Second World War. I cite many examples of where they see their role is to liberate the fatherland, to free Hanover from the humiliation of Napoleonic occupation. So this is true even of the rank and file. So it's not a case simply of these people being desperate for payment, that they're somehow the scum of the earth, in a much used phrase in another context. These are in many ways ideological warriors. And the King's German Legion served very widely in the Napoleonic Wars. The 2nd Light Battalion had previously fought in Spain, in the Low Countries, and southern France. And I think the remarkable resilience of these men at La Haye Sainte, which I document at length, is to do partly to their being a primary group, a cohesion which is regionally derived, but also many of the men who are from other units hadn't known each other before. But in any case, most of them have a strong ideological sense of being embarked in a project against Napoleonic domination. Now, why do I see the King's German Legion as a potential model for NATO or for a Eurozone army, which would be the obvious extension? Obvious to me at any rate. It's because the King's German Legion mobilized the resources of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire for the common project of freeing Europe from French domination. It placed them into units where the language of command was English. Equipment and uniforms were standard across the British Army. So the line units wore red, the riflemen wore green. So they were part of a multinational army within a coalition with a supreme commander, Wellington, whose army was, in a sense, European. So even before the Prussians arrive, only 36% of his army are British, 10% are King's German Legion, i.e. German, 10% Nassauers, again Germans, 8% Brunswickers, 13% Dutch, 6% Belgian. So the majority are, in fact, not English speakers in the narrow sense. I say this not to deny the British involvement or to say that this was a German victory, but to make the point that this is a European effort. And Lord Bramall, former chief of the British Defence Staff, once described it as the first NATO victory. Now, I am aware there is an alternative Napoleonic tradition for a European army. Napoleon's army is very multinational. They recruited within metropolitan France, the satellite states, the conquered areas. The Grande Armée, which went into Russia in 1812, famously contained a preponderance of non-Frenchmen.
Yeah.
And even at Leipzig in 1813, there were many Germans in the French army. My point, though, is that, first of all, by Waterloo, the French army was no longer a European one, so it was truly a European army facing a largely French one. But also that even when Napoleon's army was European in many respects, it was not an appropriate model for the present day because it was a hegemonic and aggressive model as opposed to being a federal and offensive one, which is what I believe the King's German Legion and Wellington's army largely stood for. So finally, I would argue that the King's German Legion is a better model for a future Eurozone army. It would in particular solve the German problem within the military mobilization of Europe. That is to say, it provides an example of how the military resources of Central Europe could be mobilized for a common cause. It's a tradition to which the Germans, who, as I said, have an unease with military power, could appeal. Partly because it would be a common ideological project, which is the defense of democracy in Europe. Partly also because somebody like Bering, commander at La Haye Sainte, is the model of a responsible commander. He does not, unlike Antida, for example, sacrifice himself or his men in a forlorn hope. He completes his mission, he defends as long as he can, he holds on as long as he can, and then he withdraws without sacrificing his men pointlessly. So for all these reasons, and this would be my parting shot, I commend to you the story of the King's German Legion at Waterloo. First of all, as an engrossing drama of courage and endurance in its own right, and secondly, as a model for the common Eurozone army we so desperately need today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brendan. This is clearly something that you don't hear that often anymore in Brussels these days. First of all, really sound military history, and then also a plea for a really federalized European army. Those are things that Brussels doesn't really talk about a lot, and this is why it's very much our gain that you've come tonight. I have a quick question. You're stressing that this was a European army, very much integrated in a way that few military armies usually are. If they had lost that battle, could that international army have survived? What would it have done?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that if Wellington had been defeated at Waterloo, it's highly likely that Napoleon would then have caught up with Blücher and destroyed Blücher's army. Whether Napoleon would then have won the war, or have at least reached some kind of negotiated settlement, of which he'd in the past shown himself incapable, and thereby changed the course of European history, of course is not clear, because you could make the objection that there were Austrian and Russian and other armies hastening towards France, and that you would simply have had a rerun of what had happened in 1830 and 1814, and I can't exclude that. But the fact is, Wellington did win in 1815, and therefore the victory bore quite rightly his imprint, and it was very much also something which gave Britain standing in the future the continuing negotiations at the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, I'm asking this because, of course, it's not only the army that matters here, but whether the idea behind such an international army could have survived, and therefore, in a sense, the European idea, I guess, right? In a way that you're describing it.
Well, that's a fair point. On the other hand, you could argue that it was precisely the Napoleonic challenge which had driven this high degree of European unity. And so that Europe had come progressively together, having started out in the 1790s, and really for more than a decade, being very divided over how to respond, eventually had found themselves more or less on the same page. And you could argue that the absence of a direct military threat after 1815 is one of the factors which then causes European unity somewhat to fragment. Of course, they're trying to keep an eye on France, you've got an army of occupation and so on, but the French basically play ball after 1815. So the counterfactual might be, how would Europe have looked if you'd had a Napoleonic regime after 1815, just waiting to restart, if you like, a kind of a Cold War, post-1945 style? That would probably have been quite conducive to greater European understanding. But that's a counterfactual. But you asked me to play the game. So.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much, Brendan. I hand it over to Jamie, who's already shivering with anticipation. He wants to say a few things. I can almost feel it. and so the stage is yours.
Well, thanks, Jan. I've been reading so many books for this, so I simply have to at least say a few words to sort of justify, vis-a-vis to my wife, my sort of self-imposed monastic isolation over Christmas, trying to become an overnight expert on the Battle of Waterloo. But thanks a lot for inviting me. These are the things I really like to do. The first thing, and looking also commenting on what Brendan has said, is to sort of look at the significance of Waterloo as a decisive battle. The irony of this is that Napoleon had fought 60 battles, or 59 before Waterloo, won, the vast majority. I think he lost 7. And each time he was looking for that decisive battle, which would persuade the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, even the Brits, to give up and allow him his hegemony of Europe. And of course, he was great at winning battles, but he never had the decisive one. And then sooner or later, the peace broke down and the war resumed. The irony is that the decisive battle was the one ultimately against him. And Brendan, at the beginning of his book, quotes from Victor Hugo, who says that Waterloo was not a battle, or not just a battle, but a change in the direction of the world. Metternich finished his memoirs in 1815, saying that after that, history had become ordinary. And it's true that Waterloo puts a stop to this rather dramatic, even exciting period in human history. Life becomes a little bit more boring afterwards. But that said, let's not forget that it's very easy to start wars. It's very difficult to bring wars to an end. We speak of the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War. World War I was the prelude, of course, to World War II. Even that was the experience of Napoleon. He couldn't end wars. The animosity that was built up started a new cycle very quickly. And those Napoleonic wars were devastating for Europe. I mean, after the Second World War, of course, probably a figure of 3 million dead may look comparatively modest, but 3 million soldiers died in the Napoleonic Wars, which dragged on for 25 years. 1.4 of those were French. In other words, the French lost about the same as they lost in World War I, military dead. 1 million civilians were killed. So this was a devastating period of human history, European history. It took 7 coalitions alone to defeat Napoleon. But as Brendan says, the first point is that after Waterloo, we had a period of relative peace. Brendan spoke of 50 years. I would even push it as far as 100. Of course, there were wars in between, Crimea, the Franco-Prussian War, but the basic sort of state system prevented Europe from degenerating into a generalized warfare until 1914. So Waterloo, I think, was significant in that finally a war came to an end. And as obviously we look at Ukraine at the moment, a new conflict starting, let's remind ourselves that it's very easy for people to start these conflicts. It's not so easy to end them. Again, Napoleon was a good general. He was hopeless at political reconciliation. He couldn't transform his victories into lasting understandings. He tried with the Tsar at Tilsit in 1807. That broke down. He tried with Metternich. He even married himself into the Austrian royal family to try to secure peace. He was not a good reconciler. Secondly, consequences of Waterloo, and Brenda mentioned this. Waterloo had some major impacts. So look at the UK. Before Waterloo, or before the Napoleonic Wars, we were basically a colonial power. Wellington was an Indian general. That's where he made his reputation. We had a colonial army. We finished Waterloo with 600,000 Brits in the army, the largest at the time. We became the European offshore balancer for the remainder of the 19th century. But the Peace of Waterloo, because it led to peace, allowed the UK to then distract its efforts and build an empire. The British Empire would not have happened without Waterloo. Ironically, in 1814, the bulk of our forces were in the United States, still confronting the Americans at that time. But the Peace of Waterloo also came at the same time, as Brendan points out in his magistral book, Europe, The Struggle for Supremacy, with the Treaty of Ghent, which put a stop to the war against the United States. So that peace with vis-a-vis the US, peace in Europe, is the foundation of British empire building. The 19th century, because of Waterloo, became largely a British century. But secondly, look at the Prussia being beaten very easily by Napoleon at the beginning of the wars, suddenly transforming itself through military organisation under Hardenberg and Stein into a significant military power. There's no doubt about it that Napoleon didn't quite get the German unification he had intended based on French hegemony and the Confederation of the Rhine, but Austria no longer was a Western power. Brendan, you point that out. After Waterloo, Prussia became the dominant force in Germany. Russia, too. Russia comes in for the first time significantly into the European balance of power through Waterloo. In 1814, the Cossacks were camping out in the Bois de Boulogne. They expanded their territory significantly after Waterloo into Finland, into Bessarabia. And so this whole question of we need Russia as an ally, think World War I, think World War II, to defeat the European troublemakers. But what price do we pay when we engage such a large and often rapacious power historically into the European system? And because we're in Belgium, I can't but mention that, of course, Napoleon's defeat leads to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The Belgians are put under Dutch rule, but not for very long. In 1830. So even the emergence of Belgian independence is something. But the real consequences, which I found very interesting of all of this, are the fact that suddenly European security depends upon the cooperation of the great powers. Brendan, you mentioned this. They come together to fight Napoleon as the hegemon very successfully. And the lesson is, as you said, Napoleon is great at defeating them individually, but once they combine into a coalition, he can't do that any longer. The aftermath of Waterloo was a sort of hope that we would have a sort of new golden age of European security when the Congress of Vienna would act as a kind of concert of Europe as a state system to deal with troublemakers and enhance cooperation. It was a security order. And of course today, as we look at embracing Russia, going back also to an entente among Europeans' major players, are we able to go back to that particular model? Just a few remarks on the battle itself. Waterloo, 2/3 of the deaths were through artillery. It was a defensive battle. Wellington was inferior in numbers and massively inferior in guns, but he won. He staked out a defensive position and he forced Napoleon to attack him. One thinks of the link between Waterloo and, to some degree, the trenches of World War I. It starts to mark after a period in which war was mainly manoeuvre, outflanking. When we think of Napoleon's early victories, horsemen, soldiers, to where tactics, defensive positions, fortifications like Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, which become virtually impregnable, at least for much of the battle. Artillery begin to weigh. And the destructiveness. So Waterloo was one of, with Borodino, the most destructive battles in European history up until that time, with 30,000 French killed, 17,000 Anglo-Dutch, about 7,000 Prussians. Napoleon should have won before Waterloo. That's the great irony. If he'd sort of been a bit more astute at exploiting his successes against Prussia at Ligny 2 days before, or at Quatre Bras against Wellington, if they'd exploited the retreat of the Brits at the time, and the Anglo-Dutch, or the of Prussians, Napoleon could have won. To some degree, for Napoleon, Waterloo was an unnecessary battle, which resulted from his earlier failures. Of course, what also is important, as you mentioned, the notion of not exploiting success. Terrible situational awareness, not knowing where your enemy is. Napoleon wasted his assets, sending them off to find the Prussians in different locations, Grouchy and Wavre, Lubbow on the Lahn River, and not finding the Prussians, and this sort of fog of war. And as we think of the situation that NATO is in today, having the right situational awareness so that your troops are in the right place against the right threat at the right time, I think is a key lesson that we should learn. Would it have mattered? I tend here to agree with Brendan. I think the victory of the Allies, to some degree, was more important than the defeat of Napoleon, because I think by the time that Napoleon had returned after his exile in Elba, the French were very exhausted. He could only get 15,000 volunteers. He had to use conscription in order to have an army. And even if we'd lost Waterloo, I think that the coalition, which was not to defeat France, the Congress of Vienna did not declare war on France, because the legitimate power in France was Louis XVIII. They declared war on Napoleon. I think that they probably would have held together. France was exhausted. Even though Napoleon, in a fit of madness, did return to France temporarily and entertain the prospect that he could raise 150,000 troops and return to the battle. Well, what are the lessons? ABBA, in their famous song, say that the history book on the shelf is always repeating itself. And I think that there is some truth. But there are 4 things I just very briefly would like to return to at the end. Number 1, trust among allies. Wellington took unbelievable risks at Waterloo with an inferior force in numbers, that he could hold on and that Blucher would arrive. And Blucher, having been completely wasted at Ligny and with his chief of staff, Gneisenau, sort of advising him at certain stages to pull back to Liège, could have well decided to leave it to Wellington. But they trusted each other to stay together as allies. That was the decisive thing. As Obama would put it, he had my back. And again, at the time when NATO is looking at the Eastern European allies who are a little bit nervous of what has happened in the wake of Ukraine, no military strategy works unless it's based on that degree of trust. Second lesson, hold on to your alliances. As Brendan says, the great tragedy of post-Waterloo is that, for example, the Brits and the Germans in particular, who had this magnificent sort of entente based on the joint monarchy of Hanover, with the 46% of the Anglo-Dutch army, which based on German speakers, and don't forget that 20% were Belgians and Dutch as well, that having sort of had that wonderful entente, we were able to keep it. And by the late 19th century, Britain and Germany, despite interlocked royal families and business interests and a great deal of mutual admiration, even attempts to form alliances with each other, failed and became adversaries. I'm not arguing that the First World War was caused because the Anglo-German relationship broke down, but I think you could argue that it was one of the decisive factors. So if you've got an alliance, hold on to it. And I think looking at the United States at the moment and our Canadian friends in the current context, our ability to stay together is key. The third thing I'd like to say, particularly looking at Mr. Putin in Ukraine at the moment, is the lesson of Napoleon is that you can't force your ideology down somebody else's throat with military power, at least not for long. Talleyrand famously warned Napoleon that he couldn't export freedom at the barrel of a gun, that this would fail. The Napoleonic system had to be based on consent, which clearly it wasn't. And of course, afterwards, the coalition, the Concert of Vienna, went through the same experience in trying to force reaction. Think of Nicholas I in particular, down the throats of the Poles or the Austrians, down the throats of the Italians, and so on. This attempt, to sort of ward off the springtime of the nations through reaction lasted a while, but ultimately failed as well. Hitler's project also failed. So ultimately, we cannot employ military force to stop people expressing their aspirations. Finally, the Europeans had to take responsibility for themselves in 1815. And here I sort of come very much to Brendan's thinking, if not about a European army or a Eurozone army, but at least a sense of European defence cooperation, even if we have to keep the alliance with the United States. It was this sort of wake-up call, particularly among the Russians and the Prussians and the Austrians, who had their own rivalries, the Brits, who realised that they couldn't simply finance the coalitions. They could only remember, Wellington and Napoleon faced each other at Waterloo for the first time. It was the bony versus nosy clash. You know, neither could become the complete general before they defeated the other. You know, Wellington said to Napoleon that his presence was worth 40,000 troops, although that didn't work on that day. And when Napoleon died, Wellington said, "Great, now I'm the world's most famous general." So to some degree, it was a fantastic clash of personalities. But the victory came because this sudden realization, including the British at the time, that they had to put a force on the land, on the continent. They had to defeat Napoleon on his doorstep. You know, they couldn't simply pay for the others to try to do the job. This realization that, you know, we can only deal with the job, we're all in the same boat. And I think, again, there's a big lesson for European defence today as well for all of us. So those would be my sort of parting thoughts. Hold on to alliances, trust. You can't impose ideology at the barrel of the gun, and ultimately Europe can only be successful if everybody buries the hatchet of rivalries and takes a collective responsibility for their own security. Thank you.
Jamie, fantastic. Thank you very much. As always, you know, fit to print. Let me be the devil's advocate just for one question, actually. You said that you can't export ideology at the barrel of the gun and force down your kind of model, political model or social model, down occupied people in a sense. But what Napoleon indeed exported, at least to a certain extent, and this is what his defenders always say, was a version of modernity, of modern statehood, of proper administration, of better education, of a legal code that modernized Europe. And of course, that also came to an end. And what we saw then afterwards was the Congress of Vienna, restoration, you know, the old order coming back. To a certain extent, that was going back, you know, to a state of pre-modern political order in a way. Or is that a completely false way of describing it?
Well, again, I turn to Brendan here, who's the historian. But what I would say is that, first of all, Napoleon's vision, and he was very explicit about this, was that the European system, which would be an Enlightenment system, and indeed Andrew Roberts, in his fantastic biography of Napoleon, which I read to prepare for today, called Napoleon Enlightenment on horseback. Which is a wonderful expression. So yes, you're right, Napoleon spread his code, he was proud of this. He once said that, you know, nobody will remember my 40 victories, but after I die, everybody will remember the Code Napoleon and the French legal system, and to some degree he's right. Several other countries in Europe still follow that code today, but it was very much an extractive system. Let's have been, no doubt about that. The continental system was designed explicitly to aid the French economy. The French sort of conscripted, as Brendan says, large numbers of Germans and others to go and fight. What the difference was is that at Waterloo, those others, the Dutch, the Belgians, the German speakers, the King's German Legion, actually stood up and fought, whereas the 50% of German speakers that Napoleon sent off to Russia, many of them deserted. Really, it was only the French by the time they reached Moscow. So, yes, it brought enlightenment, but very much under the notion that it would be good for France, it would be led for France, it would be directly under French domination. And therefore, at the end of the day, particularly I think in Germany, the Waterloo was seen as sort of liberation from, yes, an enlightened sort of dictator or tyrant, but a tyrant nonetheless. And you could argue that if Napoleon maybe had been less extractive, for example, imposing his continental system on Russia or on the northern German states, which crippled their economies because it prevented them from trading, they might have been happier at staying in the Napoleonic sort of community for a long long time, but the continental system, as I say, was seen as a major economic loss for their trade. But I'll turn to Brendan here, who's got probably more knowledge of that. Even Hitler imagined in his day that he was bringing enlightenment, just like the Soviet Union believed also in its day that the export of communism was bringing a more fairer, more just system, the future, and a sense of enlightenment. So to some degree, all great sort of dictatorships believe that they are also spreading a certain sort of model, but whether the subject people see it in quite the same way as the hegemonic power is something we can debate, and I don't think they did.
Brendan, you want to come in on
Well,
this real quick?
the rhetoric and the aspiration is in many respects enlightened, but the reality, as Jamie says, was anything but. It's not just, and he's absolutely right, a question of the extractive nature of the French state. There's also the attempt to reintroduce slavery in the Caribbean as part of a revival of the French colonial project, arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, judicial murder, perpetual war we've already spoken about, the war on religion, on simple revealed and received belief, as opposed to on superstition, and the creation of a new nobility, a re-feudalization of Europe, a distribution of spoils, the creation of a whole new aristocratic class of landed proprietors, essentially his generals, with lands in Italy and particularly in Germany. So a highly exploitative and dominatory system, the back of which I think was very fortunately seen in 1815, whatever the problems were with the order that followed.
Here in
And he imposed, every time he won a victory, massive indemnities, sort of reparations, I think we would have called them after 1919, on the countries that he'd been defeated, which sort of ransacked their treasury. And the French armies, of course, as armies did at that time, more or less sort of fed themselves off the land and so on, causing major food shortages. Of course, certain countries like Russia, with their scorched earth policy, also inflicted tremendous damage on their own populations, at least in terms of denying Napoleon that type of access. So I tend to agree with Brendan. I think if you were sort of an average citizen, this probably didn't feel very much like enlightenment or liberation.
I rest my case here, obviously, but the other question that I have is, well, here in Brussels, in the Euro bubble, when it's a high degree of idealism still for the integration project, and people will, of course, say that this is kind of the result of history, and that the Second World War, the First World War are all kind of heavily inscribed into this new political order that the Europeans sought for themselves. They never wanted to repeat these things, and so the DNA of today's Europe is certainly in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. To what extent do you think today's European DNA still has some of that Napoleonic time inscribed into it? To what extent, maybe even Waterloo in it? Are there traces? Does this still inform the debate, or is this a historian's hobby?
No, I think those echoes are there, certainly in current rhetoric. So you'll hear, probably much more than I do, people in Britain writing about Brussels and the Commission and the bureaucracy as having a Napoleonic hierarchical vision for Europe against which a doughty Britain is resisting. So it's there in that. And also in the aspiration for standardization and acquis and to a certain extent and this kind of thing. So I think it is omnipresent, yes.
Before we hand it to the audience, I have a final question on Germany in this context. Germany at the time was still an undefined landmass in the center of Europe. Napoleon had tried to consolidate it a little bit, was partly successful. The Prussians then emerged as a more important power at the time, but still it was fractured. And European history, as you described so brilliantly in your supremacy book, was a struggle over dominance of that kind of undefined, unstructured, mess in the middle. And today we have a debate again about Germany, having to lead, partially already leading, having a certain idea, but not really being up to it entirely. It's now much more defined, territorially, obviously, but that central power of Europe that lies still in the middle of the continent is at least partially undefined still, or doesn't really know what to do with it. Is that, I mean, is that a fair thing? How does the historian look at this? I mean, we are here in the trenches of the daily political battles. What has the historian to say about this, and where do you think the travel is going?
Well, it was ever thus. I mean, the principal argument of my book on Europe, which is much bigger than this little shocker on the Battle of Waterloo, its central argument is that what's driving European history is the German question, which, in the area we're talking about just now, is to do with how you order that space at the heart of Europe in such a way that it will be resilient enough to deter outside predators, because whoever controls Germany will control the resources of Germany. So be it Louis XIV, be it Sultan Suleiman, or whoever. And yet at the same time, it should not be so strong as to threaten from the center the peace of Europe, which is of course what happened ultimately under the Kaiser. You can argue who was principally to blame for that. Certainly that was true under Hitler. And the arrangements that were put in place after the Battle of Waterloo reflected that preoccupation, which was you have a German confederation which is meant to have a confederal army made up of contingents from the different German states, which are designed in such a way as to keep out the French and the Russians, essentially. And yet, they're not really strong enough, credibly, to deter France, for example, during the Rhine crisis of 1840. And the result is that the Prussians, whom you mentioned in your question, become the protagonists, the guardian of the gate in the West. And as a result of the Vienna settlement, they've been given the Rhineland, so they've been given a territory contiguous with France to guard against French expansion. And therefore the Prussians take on the mantle of German nationalism. Now, so that is how the German question leads to the 19th century problem, which leads to the 20th century cataclysms, which produce the European Union. So the European Union, therefore, understood conventionally as a project to diffuse the tensions of Central and Western Europeans amongst each other. But that, of course, is only part of the story, because it's not merely to diffuse, to contain Germany. It's also conceived very much in the 50s as a project to mobilize. Think of the European defense community, a way of getting Europeans to defend themselves against the threat of Soviet communism. And that's rather an aspect of the European project, I think, that's been lost over time. But either way, Germany is absolutely central to this, because Germany has to be either contained or, better still, mobilized. But it's always at the heart of this story, whether that be in the big picture, as I said in my book on Europe, or in this little picture at Waterloo, which for me is a microcosmic example of how it can be done. The King's German Legion is an instance of how Germans can be mobilized for the good cause within a multilateral context.
Mobilizing Germany, how can it be done? Your big boss, in an interview in Berlin, just said, Stoltenberg, of course, NATO Secretary General, said that Germany was really key to the future structure of NATO in this current standoff, also, over Ukraine, perhaps, in the Readiness Action Plan and the Wales conclusions, and that Germany was the key building block in this. If Germany wouldn't come to the fore, then the rest of the alliance would have a problem. So from what Brendan just said to your daily troubles of today, how do you see that? I know that you can't completely, trounce the Germans now.
Wouldn't want to, actually.
All right.
No. Well, the first thing, of course, is that Germany today doesn't have to deal any longer with Bismarck's Kuschma of the coalitions. In other words, worrying about a war on the Western Front or conflict on the Eastern Front, and this perpetual shifting of alliances that went on from the Bismarck period onwards to try to find the perfect combination. So to that extent, the German issue is solved, to the extent that Germany in NATO and the European Union is now embedded in a strong system of security. The problem, of course, with that is that when your security problem is more or less solved, the rationale for an army or for defence diminishes as well. we're at peace. For the first time in our history, we have neighbours on all sides, our friends. We don't need any longer to sort of balance. You know, the problem of Waterloo, very briefly, was that it sort of created a five-power system in Europe. No one was dominant, not even Germany. And therefore, security meant that I've got to have 3 out of 5. You know? And Bismarck, always with, you know, the Dreikaiserbund and others, the Reassurance Treaty, was very keen to make sure he had 3, and the others, the French in particular, the revanchists, only 2. And of course, that was the system that disappeared after Bismarck disappeared. That issue is solved now for Germany. Germany's now got 28 all on its side. So the problem, Jan, is exactly to sort of give a convincing rationale for why armies, why military force, when it's really about helping your neighbours much more than helping yourself. That said, you know, you as a think tanker, you're paid to be pessimistic, and I as a distinguished bureaucrat am paid to be optimistic. And I think in general, the way in which Germany has responded to the Ukraine crisis does show an acceptance of responsibility. Okay, true, the defence budget has not sort of shot up to the magical 2% of GDP mark that everybody agreed to at the Wales summit. But if you look at what Germany is doing, you know, it's put ships in the Baltic Sea, it's been part of the reassurance issues, it's one of the first nations to contribute to NATO's very high readiness force. It's offered this German-Polish headquarters in Poland as the basic building block for this type of structure. So you do see that, you know, the Germans are not absent from all of this. The key issue, though, is that we are now coming to a time when our military forces are under more pressure than any time before. And indeed, look at the way the military are now being used for homeland defence. You know, Belgium has got troops on the streets of Brussels. France has had to keep 10,000 troops back from Mali or Central African Republic, or at least preparation, to put them on the streets of Paris. We have the East and the South. So that kind of weight of the major expeditionary operations that was on the shoulders of the British and the French isn't sustainable any longer. You look around, Europe's most powerful economy, the only one that doesn't have any budget deficit for the time being, the one with obviously the leading role, obviously has to therefore take on an additional responsibility, simply given the multiplicity of different tasks that our armed forces are being asked to serve. I think the evolution in Germany is happening. The question is what can we do at NATO, and what can my boss do to sort of speed it up a little bit? But I don't see it in totally negative terms.
We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much. And now I hope that you have your questions ready, and that we will have a good discussion. We've covered so much ground, from your farmhouse to our world today. General Bradshaw, I know that your time is limited, so I want to give you the first question, and then we go over to Nicholas, and then to Sven, and then to the other side.
Thanks very much. Well, it's not so much a question as an observation before I thin out, which is probably a bit of a cheats thing to do. But firstly, to thank the two speakers for 2 fascinating talks. And Jamie, congratulations on getting ABBA into a talk at such a highbrow.
Sorry to lower the tone of the proceedings.
but of course, you couldn't leave them out in something that was about Waterloo, I suppose. But anyway, Brendan, you presented a vision of a security model for Europe in the future. With a multinational alliance, rather like Wellington's army, and I would say that you've got that with NATO, within it structures of about a brigade size, which are relying on a framework nation with a number of smaller nations in them. And I think you're just about to see that emerge in a series of very high readiness joint task forces, which have come out of the Ukrainian problem, but actually will have utility not just in the sense of collective defense against Russia or whoever else, but also to deal with a number of problems around the margins of NATO. And you talked of a mobilized Germany, and I have to say I'm struggling to see the sense in which Germany hasn't been mobilized for the defense of Europe since the formation of NATO, since it's been a key player throughout. And even in our external activity in Afghanistan, despite the reticence in Germany about overseas expeditionary activity, they are one of the bigger players in Operation Resolute Support in Afghanistan now. But the Very High Readiness Task Forces will be based around a framework nation. We hope there will be 5 or 6 of them. They will be about brigade-sized, but have a number of nations within them. The UK have already indicated that they will be providing the framework for one of those, and it might well see a number of nations who are operating within the UK Joint Expeditionary Force, that is to say Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, also Denmark, Norway, possibly Holland. So quite a good multinational grouping, and we expect to see, as I say, 5 or 6 of these come forward. So I think the sort of model you describe is the model that we will have, and Germany is indicating fairly positively that they also will be a framework nation for one of these Very High Readiness Joint Task Forces. We very much hope they'll make an announcement, and maybe even in the next couple of days at a meeting here in Brussels we'll hear something of that nature. So I think the vision you spell out is on the verge of delivery, and interestingly, the United States probably won't be the framework nation for one of the Very High Readiness Joint Task Forces, but remains locked in by providing support to all of them. So a model for European defence, the fighting elements of which, the high readiness forward fighting elements of which, are very much European.
Brendan, a rapid response to this real quick?
Thank you. Well, it's good to hear that things are moving in the right direction. I think the vision that I outlined is a bit different from yours in the sense that yours is still a confederal picture, as it has to be, given the existence of sovereign states. What I think is necessary is actually Eurozone single state. And it seems to me the advantage, which would then have its own single army, the advantage of the King's German Legion was that it was a formation within the British Army. It wasn't, as it were, an auxiliary, and that a European or a Eurozone state army would be, in some sense, the aggregation of all those legions. That's really what I had in mind. As to the mobilization of Germany, I think what you say is absolutely correct until the end of the Cold War. But I think for the reasons that Jamie gave, there has been considerable slippage from that as a result of the fact that for the first time in European history, Germany is surrounded only by democratic friends. And this has led her to be not merely embedded, but in a sense feather-bedded, insulated from the outside. And so you have a situation where the European body has a chest which doesn't actually feel the pain of its extremities in the Baltic and the Mediterranean, the way that a fully integrated human being, by analogy, should. And I think it is true, although the Germans have considerably upped their game in the last few months, their reaction to the Ukraine crisis, Crimea, and harassment in the Baltic has been weak. And I was in Tartu at the Baltic Defence College only a few weeks before Christmas, and it was very striking that nobody there believed that the Germans were part of a collective effort to defend them, and German presence at the conference was absolutely minimal. And it was striking that the one country within Europe, which was furthest away, the United Kingdom, was the one that was the most strongly represented, both rhetorically and in other ways. So I slightly disagree with you on the extent to which the Germans are mobilized, but they certainly are more mobilized now than they were 6 months ago. I agree with you on that.
Thank you very much. I would like to take Nicholas and then Sven, and I think this gentleman over there has a question. Is that right? Take those 3, and then we go over to this side, then it's you, and then the next round. Nicholas first, please.
Thanks. I'll introduce myself, Nicholas White from HAPCO Worldwide, but speaking very much in a personal capacity. This was very, very interesting, and the one point I missed was actually raised just now by the General, and it's the question of what you're offering to the smaller countries. You talked a lot about England, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, the balance of the 5. There was a sort of reference to the Duke of Wellington's earlier career. What was he bringing to the Indians exactly? I'm not quite sure. And at the same time, you know, when you go to Ljubljana in Slovenia, you will find there a pillar in which are interred the ashes of the unknown French soldier, Mort pour notre liberté. Ljubljana is perhaps the one capital in Europe where you will find a monument to the unknown soldier of the Napoleonic armies. Outside France. So I really wonder what is being offered from either of your perspectives to the smaller and more subject nations in Europe, including, of course, Ireland, where we have a certain interest. That's a provocative question. I have a nice question as well, which is, do you have a favourite literary treatment of the Battle of Waterloo? Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, Thackeray from Vanity Fair, or is there one that I've missed?
All right, Sven.
Thank you. I'm Sven Bisschop from Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations of Belgium, and I teach at the University of Ghent. And one of my courses there is on Belgian foreign policy, and there's many counterintuitive bits in that. It is perhaps counterintuitive as such that Belgium has a foreign policy, but we used to. And at two instances, Belgium really requested the United Kingdom to assume the leadership of Europe, and twice Britain refused. First, to some extent, after World War I, and Britain said, well, you know, we still have an empire to run, not interested. And then after World War II, Spaak almost begged Britain to assume the leadership of his project of the Western Union, and Britain then said, I guess, well, now we're losing an empire, we definitely don't have time, and so Britain refused to assume the lead of what Spaak saw as an integrated political, economic, but also defense, security Europe as a third way between the two blocks. And so my question is therefore linking is now to the Napoleonic Wars. You both stressed the importance of coalitions, but you could also say what made these coalitions stick was Britain, was British leadership, recreating them time and again and bankrolling them. And so the whole thing worked because Britain took the lead. And then I could ask, well, where is Britain today in taking the lead? Is it sort of stuck in its self-assumed role of eternal deputy sheriff of the United States, where it could very well be the #1 magistrate of this Eurozone army? Well, let's call it a European army. You can keep the pound sterling for a little while. Thank you.
Thanks, Sven. And then this gentleman over here, and then we take in your answers. Please introduce yourself.
Ulrich Sante from the German representation at NATO. First of all, many thanks to Brendan Smith for a great idea of looking at the coalition in Waterloo as perhaps the point of inspiration and departure for what one day may become a European army. Many thanks to Jamie Shea and to Dieter Kerr for explaining the German position and what we do at the moment to implement Wales. I may want to add that the interim VGTF will be led by Germany, and it will be used as the testbed, so to say, for the VGTF to come. So there's a lot that Germany contributes, I think, in the first row to implementing what was decided by the heads of state and government in Wales these days. I would like to come back to the idea of a European army. What I see is that between France and Germany today, the idea of creating a European army is not such a big deal, and Germany, I think, would be willing to even give up some of its sovereignty to enable such a European army to become reality, which actually in Article 42, I think, if I remember right, in the Treaty of Lisbon, is the vision of the Treaty of Lisbon. I see that France and Great Britain, on the other hand, looking at the summit of, what was it, 2010 or 2011, actually agreed on many issues which could be taken as the basic structure of some military cooperation which could lead in the end perhaps to something more structured in military cooperation within Europe. What I don't see is what Brendan Smith at the beginning of his talk actually saw as a vision, namely a cooperation between Germany and Great Britain, between UK and Great Britain, as being the starting point for a European army. So my question to you both is, what has to change in Europe, what has to change in the UK, in Great Britain, what has to change in Germany to actually bring these three together, that at one point in history, 200 years ago, and through history have jointly worked together at one point and the other, and nowadays where we need them most, they don't seem to be able to agree on what they signed in Lisbon as their common vision.
Thank you very much. Great questions, big questions. Who wants to start? Brendan?
May I? Well, thank you very much. I'll turn first to my compatriot, Nicholas White. what does this vision offer to smaller countries? It depends obviously on the smaller country, but the principal smaller countries that would benefit from such a security union would be the Baltic states, would be Romania, anybody in the front line against the Russians. Ditto, I think, also Portugal, Malta, anybody in the front line in the Mediterranean. One country which I think would not benefit from it is Ireland. And the simple reason for that is that Ireland has, in geopolitical terms, the absolute A1 piece of real estate in 21st century history. And if you want to be located in the best position, you are located between the United Kingdom and the United States. Things can go wrong, but that is probably the best place to be. Where you don't want to be in the 20th century is between Germany and Russia, and that is the fate of very many people. And if you think of the enormous racket that Irish nationalists make about their fate, and you compare it with the fate of other Europeans, and I think Ireland would have to be a net contributor to such a security union, and it would be a net beneficiary economically and in other ways. It's a deal. You put in, you take out, and you take out in different ways. I'll come back to that in a minute vis-à-vis the United Kingdom. So the other two questions, and the best literary representation is, of course, Sharp's Waterloo. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I do recommend it. Also the TV series. The other two questions were extremely apposite, because, again, they related to the issue of where Britain fits in contemporary Europe. And here I'm going to annoy a lot of people by saying that I do see that Britain has historically been a leader of these coalitions in the past. Churchill, or rather Britain, was turned to by SPARC, as you say, after World War II, but that's very much a federal vision for Europe, which was to end at some point in a basically European federation. And Churchill's, I know it wasn't Churchill, but Churchill in that case gave this speech in Zurich about the need for a federal Europe, but he was very clear that Britain would not be part of it. And the reason for that is that Europe, the European project, there's no nice way of saying this, was designed and is designed to fix something in Europe that was never broken in Britain, which is the fact that Europe was in the throes of dictatorship, exposed to external attack, and so on. Britain was really the only country in Europe, only major player, which came through that challenge victorious. And so the argument as to why a people should give up its sovereignty for a greater good, that's an argument which doesn't apply to Great Britain, because it had its own union for very similar reasons in 1707, when the English and the Scots pooled their sovereignty and their military power and their economic power. And my meta argument, which I didn't make tonight, but I've made in the European book and various pieces in the popular prints, is that what the Eurozone needs to do is a variant of that historical experience that the English and the Scots underwent, which is the creation of a security and fiscal union. So we don't need to make the point unambiguously clear. We don't need a British Europe, which is more or less the implication of both of your questions, but we don't need a European Britain, but we need a British Europe. In other words, a Eurozone built up on these Anglo-American constitutional principles of security union. And if we have that, then the problem that you've both described goes away, because you simply have a realignment within NATO. Instead of having lots of different states within NATO, you'll essentially have two, or two European ones, which is the United Kingdom and the United Eurozone state. So that would be my answer on that.
Yeah, I'll have a stab at these as well. First of all, Nick, I'll ignore your remark about Wellington and India, because I wasn't making the point that he was there as a liberator, as you well know. But you're right, of course. I mean, the Napoleonic period, in a way, is not conducive to the interests of small states. Let's be clear. You could argue that Napoleon did, with his sort of Rhineland Confederation, his creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, which was not the same thing as an independent Poland. His sponsorship of the Transalpine Republic and different arrangements in Italy at least set in train the kind of sense of nationalism and self-determination in a very limited way that obviously became such a feature of Europe after Versailles and Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points in 1919. In reality, looking at it, the only small state that really did well out of the Napoleonic Wars was Switzerland, which had its neutrality internationally guaranteed at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Literary model. I'm going to choose Stendhal, one of my favourite writers, and La Chartreuse de Parme, one of my favourite novels, with Fabrice de Dongo being on the battlefield of Waterloo and becoming totally confused with what's going on. Wellington famously said when he was asked to describe the Battle of Waterloo, it's like, it's impossible. It's like asking me to describe a dance. But what's interesting is, and here I come to Brendan's book, which of course is the purpose of our debate this evening, because what I think Brendan does very well in this book, and I'm not trying to flatter you, Brendan, or even to sell you more copies, for which I will receive not even a 1% of your royalties, modest as no doubt they are, but is that you managed to sort of describe this sort of fog of war sort of sense, the sense of chaos sort of that's going on all around, particularly for these 400 beleaguered members of the King's German Legion in the farmhouse, by giving a sense of the overall battle. The great tragedy, to my mind, for the French at Waterloo was that sort of confusion of Fabrice del Dongo existed at the level of the generals, particularly Ney, sort of wasting the French cavalry, thinking he's sort of pursuing retreating Anglo-Dutch soldiers when in fact they're not retreating at all, and so on. So the idea of confusion in warfare. The UK, Sven's question, absolutely. The Brits, as I said, during the Napoleonic Wars, believed that they could deal with Napoleon by financing other people's coalitions. We were the paymasters, General. It was only when Britain, as I said, realised that it had to engage along with the others and sort of put skin in the game, even at the cost of a lot of British soldiers who died in Spain and at Waterloo, that finally we had a resolution. Unfortunately, yes, you're right, the UK didn't learn that lesson. Waterloo succeeded too well, because then we went back to this role of the offshore balancer. And indeed, maybe the tragedy is that the countries that we fought the First World War with, or could have been an alliance with, like Germany, we came into antagonism with those countries precisely because we weren't dealing with them in Europe. We were competing with them in colonial expeditions. Remember Germany and the Weltpolitik, the naval build-up, the fear that Germany would sort of take away, the Platz an der Sonne, and take away Britain's colonies or disrupt our trade routes, the fights with France over Morocco, Egypt, Fashoda, the fights with Afghanistan, with Russia over Afghanistan and India. To some degree, if we'd have been more focused on Europe, we might have formed alliances sooner. The great tragedy of the First World War is both the French and the Russians believed that they could count on the British to stay in, and the Germans, right up to the end, were convinced that they could persuade Britain to stay out because our position was basically ambiguous about where our commitments were. There's a famous story, Jan, of the Kaiser ordering champagne to be opened 2 days before the war broke out because he had a message from the German ambassador in London saying that he'd heard that the UK was now going to declare neutrality. It was totally wrong. But the fact that the Germans believed this, so to some degree our ambiguity regarding our commitments have not helped us. And then of course finally we've always been great. You think of World War I, the British Expeditionary Force, you think of World War II, you think of Napoleon Wars. We've been very good at sort of coming in after the wars have started to try to sort things out. We haven't been so good in the prevention strategy in the first place. And of course, after the Second World War, we refused to join the European defence community and so on. So what's the hope for the future? Well, this is very politically incorrect, but my sense now is that two remarks. Number one, we have to have a referendum. We have to clear the air, we have to lance the boil. We have to have a debate that makes it clear that we are part of Europe. We have to have the debate, we have to have the campaign, and we have to fight that. Just like Waterloo, there has to be a decisive victory of the pro-Europeans over the anti-Europeans, and that won't happen without a referendum, because until that time, the Eurosceptics will have the majority of the coverage. Secondly, if you look at the Scottish referendum, if you look at what's happening in Wales, in Ireland, and so on, you will see that a substantial part of the United Kingdom would probably break away if there is a sense that Britain is not going to be part of Europe. So to sort of come back to what Brendan was saying about the Act of Settlement, I sort of see that the ability of the UK to hold itself together is to some degree now dependent upon defining durably its European role and European identity. But we have to go through the referendum campaign first. The trouble today, final remark, is that if you think of Tony Blair, he sort of felt that Britain could be part of Europe in defence and security, while sort of being outside in the euro and the economic sense and social chapters and legislation and so many other things. And I think we've recognised now that that's not going to happen. We're either totally part of Europe or we're not part of Europe. But we can't have this sort of pick and choose kind of attitude. If it doesn't work in economics, it's not going to work in defence as well. And that's something I think the Germans realise and the French realise, but we don't. My final word. While Britain sort of sorts itself out on all of this, there's one area of the British policy where we're not very rational. We need patience. I think it's very easy sometimes for the French, for the Germans, our Scandinavian friends to get a bit impatient with us, and we need their sort of patience to help us along while we have this debate, and always make it clear that they want us to be in Europe rather than being on the outside. So to some degree, it's more what Berlin does than what London does.
Brilliant, very good. We have about 4 minutes left or so. I have perhaps time for two ultra quick and very short questions. This gentleman and the one here in the front row, and then ultra super speedy answers, and then we go over to the drinking and eating part of this thing.
Thank you. Christian Hamlin from the European Commission. I've been here 25 years, so I went to the reenactment 175 years after the Battle of Waterloo. Having learned from an English teacher that Battle of Waterloo was down in Trafalgar somewhere. And I said, no, that's Trafalgar, you mixed them up. Coming now to European DNA first. I come from a country which has not had any wars for 200 years. 1809 with Russia, Sweden. So luckily stayed out of all the conundrums of political warfare, if you like, and military warfare in Europe. That being said, the DNA in Sweden has changed. Why? Because of the October incidents in the Stockholm archipelago, where before that we said, as soon as the Navy starts telling us there's a Russian submarine, Minasab, oh, it's because you need more budget for military spending. No, eventually we now agree that we need to become members of NATO, because NATO is for the 28 and we're outside the 28. We're inside another 28, but that doesn't cut it. Now to the future, let's say, evolution of a Eurozone army or European army. What sort of components would it have? Sweden is right now faced with cutting down one of the military services, either the Navy, the Air Force, or the Army. We can't sustain all three. That's what the military commanders have said, and the Supreme Commander of the, let's say, Armed Forces of Sweden. What about cyber warfare? We've seen what happened with North Korea attacking Sony Pictures through internet. We've seen what the US capabilities are on the internet to shut down a country completely off the internet. And maybe the future warfare will be not to destroy, but to take over the infrastructure and use it for economic gains. So where does cyber warfare play? And one thing about books, there's a book coming out soon. I haven't actually got hold of it yet. It's called The Improbable War, where the argument is as long as one power has control over fear and can monopolize that in the world, everything is fine. When two start fighting over it, there will be military chaos. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
That was 2 minutes out of 4.
That was not ultra quick, but it was nevertheless very substantial. And now we have this question here, and then a final round with the two protagonists.
Hello, my name is Tim King, and I'm editor of something called European Voice. And as a journalist, I have sometimes indulged myself in quoting the words of ABBA and so on. And there's always a lovely proximity between the European Council in June and the reenactments. But I mean, I love this historical stuff, but the bit I want to come in and sort of piss on the parade, really, is to say, yes, Waterloo is a lovely, convenient model, and we can see all the battle buffs love the fact that they can get to this battlefield and a lot of it is still intact, and they can see the layout of things and play games. And you've got the picturesqueness of everything of the quantity of bright uniforms and so on. And you've got the literary and film representations. But what if actually this is the kind of wrong model whatsoever? That actually you get caught up in creating conversations which are the extension of the 19th century into 20th century history. But what if actually, as a model for what's going on in the 21st century, this is all a great distraction? And so I think there's a lot of us that can very much enjoy replaying an anniversary of Waterloo, but maybe that's what we shouldn't be doing. What a heretical thought.
A brilliant last question for an event that has been going on for 90 minutes. And thanks for being the skunk at the garden party. That's a great role to play in these. And it's a great question, I think. And we have two masters to give us the answers for this. This time it's Jamie who has to go first.
Well, on the Swedish thing, of course, to some degree, Sweden was Napoleon's ultimate legacy. It was the only part of his sort of, what Brendan referred to, his setting up of all of these principalities and kingdoms under the rule of his own marshals. Sweden was the only one that survived at the end of the day, because that was under Bernadotte, whose descendants sit on your throne even today. But of course, Bernadotte turned against Napoleon, which is the reason why he survived. On the question regarding today, obviously it's for Sweden itself to draw the consequences of the current situation vis-à-vis the possible challenges, vis-à-vis your resources, and to decide where you want to be. That's not something that NATO, unlike Napoleon, is going to sort of try to impose on you. The only thing I could say is that at NATO we would see it in our interest, not to sort of enter that debate, because it would be counterproductive from the word go. But at least to make it clear that you would be welcome if that would be your decision, number one. But if that is not your decision, it's not if you decide to stay where you are. Well, I wouldn't call it neutral, because I don't believe that represents really what Sweden does, which is to contribute in a major way to NATO's various operations, Afghanistan, Libya, and so on. But if you decide not to join the alliance, then to obviously facilitate pragmatic cooperation, everything except Article 5, because it's in our interest as much as your interest, and that certainly includes the cyber elements, where you are part of a group of 7 partners with whom we have a high degree of cooperation. Second issue, I take this very, it's not the skunk at a party. I think it's something that anybody who dabbles in history has to deal with. What are the uses, as Margaret Millen has famously put it, or abuses of history. And I certainly wouldn't like to get into the over-interpretation game of thinking that there are fixed lessons, or that the present is exactly like the past. In fact, those statesmen who have tended to be guided by history have often come a cropper, because it's often sort of given them a kind of sort of mechanical sense that situations are going to repeat themselves and that they should do certain things. So I don't think that what we're doing tonight is any other than entertaining, if somewhat idle, speculation. But the intellectual exercise of trying to think about history and draw the parallels does, if you do it properly, sharpen your appreciation not just of the similarities and the differences, and it does sharpen your analysis of the type of situation that we're in today. So I see this exercise as a kind of intellectual clarifier, and you're right, statesmen shouldn't apply it to sort of coming up with the next interpretation of Waterloo, but to deal better with the challenges of the present. That's why some of the best statesmen are historians, or people who read history. And a lot of the eminent statespeople of today, including the Chinese Premier, the Japanese Prime Minister, are very active students of history. Because it's not, that I need to know about the past and act in the future, but if I understand the past, I'm more likely to have a sophisticated intellectual appreciation of the predicament that I'm facing at the moment. So it's like anything else. A car, a very fast car. If you know how to use it, it's perfectly safe and even a great advantage. If you don't know how to use it, it can get you killed in 5 minutes.
Jamie, thank you. Brendan, final words.
Very quickly, I agree with what Jamie said in response to the question about Sweden. The only point I would add is that Sweden, whatever its military problems, I think is among the better organized and robuster elements in Europe. Clearly, if Europe were made up entirely of Swedens and United Kingdoms, it would have less of a military problem. I see the advantage of a single Eurozone state and army as being precisely a device to mobilize those who would otherwise not be mobilized. On the question from Tim King, welcome heresy. Of course, there is a danger, first of all, in falling into whimsy, which is always an element in these conversations. And secondly, whimsy I meant on my part. And secondly, of course, the dangers of distraction, drawing the wrong lessons, refighting the battles of the past and not being aware of the threats or the challenges, as you call them nowadays, of the future. The only point I would make is that when I sat down to write this book, research it in 2010 or thereabouts, and when my Europe book was going through its various drafts, I had very much in my mind external threats to Europe. And indeed, the final paragraphs of the Europe book talk about potential threats from outside which could unite Europe. This is now written in 2012, published in 2013, and I mentioned specifically Russian challenge to Ukraine and danger of an Islamic caliphate in the Middle East. And one of my reviewers, who shall remain nameless, he was Richard Evans, the former Regius Professor of History in Cambridge, in his review in The Guardian, before the annexation of the Crimea, said, well, this is all just fantasy. The Europe we live in is not a Europe of hard power and of threats and all the rest of it, and it's all much more interlinked and interpenetrated, and so on and so forth. So obviously he didn't foresee, and very kindly the reviewer in the Frankfurt Allgemeine went back when the German edition came out after the annexation of the Crimea and said, look, he did actually write it beforehand. So my point being that emphasis on the persistence of hard power threats, on the need to devise imaginative ways of mobilizing Europe against these threats, that I think is still a current question, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of being distracted.
But it means you might do the Crimean War as much justice as Waterloo.
Exactly, we don't know, and this is really the final word, of course, which bit of history. It's a bit like, the man who spends his money on advertising, and he says he knows half of it is wasted. He just doesn't know which half. And it's always a problem for the historian who operates by analogy, certainly.
Great, thank you very much. We have covered a lot of ground, and of course, as always, have more questions afterwards than we have answers. We have Waterloo as a potential model. We have Waterloo not as a model at all. We have Germany mobilized. We have Germany not really mobilized. And we have Britain finally fully in Europe. And then we have Britain never really fully in Europe. So that's great. That's fantastic. That sums it about up, I guess, for tonight. And to actually stomach all of this and survive it, we offer you a drink and a couple of snacks here, and I hope that you have an inspired discussion afterwards. Thank you very much to both you, Brendan, and to you, Jamie, for coming over, for reading plenty of books, but I'm sure you knew all of this beforehand already, and we're certainly a lot smarter despite having more questions. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Thank you.